A sterile millionaire found a boy crying at his ex-wife's grave. The boy's words brought him to tears. He thought he was sterile. He built a billion-dollar empire, buried love, and left compassion behind, until a boy in a wheelchair handed him a letter that shattered everything. "This is from my mom, and I'm your son." Those 9 words flipped Charles Morgan's life upside down. What followed was not just the unraveling of secrets, but a journey of painful truths, unexpected fatherhood, and a chance at redemption. Stay until the end, because what this powerful story reveals about love legacy and what it really means to be strong will leave you speechless. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. The winter wind sliced through the iron gates of Rosewood Cemetery, the sky a canvas of dull gray that matched Charles Morgan's mood. Wrapped in a cashmere coat that cost more than some people's monthly income, Charles walked with stiff steps, the bouquet in his hand, more of a social obligation than a heartfelt gesture. A titan of the pharmaceutical world, he was used to controlling every aspect of his life. Every meeting, every margin, every molecule in his labs. But this visit was the one thing he couldn't delegate or delay. Every year, on this same day, he came to place flowers at the grave of his ex-wife, Isabel. 5 years had passed since she died of lung complications. He'd rescheduled a shareholders' meeting to be here. Not because he missed her, but because appearances mattered. He moved briskly through the stone paths until he reached the familiar headstone sleek gray, engraved with her full name and the words, "Loved fiercely, laughed often." He frowned slightly. That line always struck him as sentimental fluff. Isabel had written it herself in her will. Typical of her romantic, even in death. As he placed the roses against the grave, he heard a soft sound, sniffling barely audible above the whistling wind. He turned annoyed by the interruption and noticed a small figure no more than 20 feet away, hunched over another headstone. A boy in a wheelchair. His back was turned, but his small shoulders shook with silent sobs. Charles straightened, glancing around to see if an adult was nearby. Nothing, just him, the cold, and a child who didn't belong here. At least not alone. He turned back to Isabel's grave, ready to leave. But as he did, the boy's voice stopped him. "Are you Mr. Charles Morgan?" Charles froze. The boy had rolled closer, his wheelchair tires crunching softly against the gravel. He looked to be 8, maybe 9. Pale eyes red from crying. But it wasn't the tears that unnerved Charles. It was the calmness in his voice, as if he had been preparing for this moment. "Yes," Charles answered cautiously. "Who are you?" "I'm Noah." The boy fumbled with a weathered envelope in his lap. "My mom passed away last week before she died. She made me promise to find you. She said this was important." He extended the envelope with 2 trembling hands. "She told me to give you this. Said it would explain everything." Charles hesitated. Something about the handwriting on the envelope struck him in the chest, like a thrown stone. Elegant cursive. He hadn't seen it in years, but he recognized it instantly. Isabel's. His fingers shook as he opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed slightly, written in the same hand that once left love notes on his office desk. He began reading. "Charles, if you're reading this, I'm gone. This is Noah, our son. The doctors were wrong. You were never sterile, I found out after the divorce, but didn't tell you because I knew how much you hated the idea of children. I couldn't bear the thought of you rejecting him, or worse, hurting him by staying distant like your father did to you. But I always believed there was goodness in you. I still do. He needs someone now. He needs you." The paper dropped from his hands. He stared at the boy again, at Noah, with fresh eyes. His jawline, the curve of his eyebrows, even the stubborn set of his chin. God, it was all there. His blood. His child. "Where are you staying now?" Charles asked, voice strangled. Noah looked down nowhere. "The lady from Child Services says I'll be going to a special home tomorrow because of, the chair." The words landed like bricks on Charles's chest. In a world where he controlled billion-dollar pipelines, where every decision could ripple across continents, here was something he hadn't predicted and couldn't manage like a business deal. He looked down at the boy again, frail alone, yet brave enough to keep a promise his mother made with her dying breath. And for the first time in a long, long time, Charles Morgan had no idea what to do next. What would you do if a stranger called you Dad and handed you a truth that shook your entire identity? This is only the beginning. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters in this extraordinary journey. You won't believe what comes next. The grand iron gates of Charles Morgan's estate groaned open as his sleek black sedan pulled into the curved driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, an architectural monument to wealth and precision, wrapped in glass steel and silence. Every square inch was curated, from the minimalist sculptures in the foyer to the imported marble floors. Nothing inside bore even a hint of childhood. No photographs on the walls, no scuffed shoes by the door, no signs of life outside Charles's carefully constructed image. The ride from the cemetery had been quiet. Charles had made several terse phone calls, one to his lawyer, one to his personal physician, and another to his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Whitaker, instructing her to prepare a room. Noah sat silently in the back seat, clutching a small, worn backpack that looked too light to hold a child's entire world. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He just stared out the window, watching as the world passed him by in a blur of stone and snow. "This is temporary," Charles said flatly, as Mrs. Whitaker opened the door. She blinked at the sight of the boy in the wheelchair, but said nothing, merely nodding before guiding him inside. The hallway echoed with the soft creak of the chair's wheels, their sound out of place against the backdrop of polished marble and ambient classical music. Noah was shown to a guest suite on the east wing, far from Charles's bedroom, far from the heartbeat of the house. Charles avoided his eyes, instead making arrangements for a nurse and medical consultations. The logistics were easy. He had the money, the influence, the connections. But what gnawed at him was the chaos in his own mind. He was a man of logic, of structure. And yet everything about this situation, this child, upended all of it. That night, Charles poured himself a glass of scotch and sat alone in his study. The letter from Isabel lay on the desk in front of him, its corners curled and worn from how many times he'd read it. He hated how much it rattled him. Isabel had always known how to unearth the parts of him he tried to bury. Even in death, she knew exactly where to strike. His thoughts flickered to the past, to the fights, the way she'd pleaded with him to reconsider his stance on children. "Medicine isn't just for stockholders," Charles, she'd said once, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's for people, families. Children who don't have a voice." And he had answered her with cold arithmetic. Profit drives research. Emotion bankrupts it. Back then, it had made sense. Now, staring at that letter, it felt like a monument to his own blindness. He barely slept. The next morning, Charles stepped out onto the terrace, coffee in hand, and found Noah already there. The boy was gazing out at the frost-covered garden, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. "It's beautiful," Noah said quietly, not turning to look at him. "My mom said, 'You liked order. I can see that everything's so perfect.'" Charles cleared his throat. "I've arranged for a nurse, someone to help with your care." Noah nodded. "You don't have to keep me. Mom said you might not want to." The words landed like a punch to the ribs because they were spoken with complete sincerity, without bitterness or accusation. Just fact, just resignation. Charles wanted to say something, anything, but all he managed was, "We'll wait for the DNA test. Then we'll figure things out." He turned to go, but then Noah added. She said, "You used to laugh a long time ago?" I never believed her, but maybe she was right. Charles didn't respond. He didn't know how. That night he stood outside the guest room and heard Noah crying softly. The nurse hadn't arrived yet. Charles stood there for what felt like an eternity, one hand raised as if to knock, then lowered it again. He turned and walked away, haunted by a voice he could no longer ignore. In the world of business, Charles Morgan had always been able to predict every outcome, every investment, every risk. But now, inside his own house, lived a variable he could not control, and for the first time in his life he wasn't sure he wanted to. The following afternoon brought with it an icy rain tapping like impatient fingers against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Charles Morgan's private study. He sat in his leather chair, motionless, staring at the framed DNA report he'd just received. The courier had delivered it in a sealed envelope bearing the official stamp of a clinic he trusted implicitly. A single sentence glared back at him from the clinical document. Probability of paternity. 98%. It was definitive, undeniable. Noah was his son. Charles didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe for a few seconds. There was no hiding behind assumptions or denial now. Science, the very foundation of his empire, had handed him a truth he hadn't prepared to accept. The letter from Isabel had whispered it. The report now screamed it. He walked slowly toward the East guest suite, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. Inside, he found Noah sitting by the window, sketching something in a notebook. The boy looked up, startled for a moment, and then silently closed the notebook, almost embarrassed to be caught in a moment of private expression. "I got the results," Charles said quietly. Noah's eyes searched his face. "I figured. You look different." Charles wasn't sure what the boy meant. Maybe he did look different. Maybe he was different. He cleared his throat. "I've scheduled an appointment with a pediatric specialist, the best in the state. They'll be here tomorrow to evaluate everything, and we'll make adjustments accordingly." Noah nodded, but his expression was unreadable. That evening, Charles reviewed the archives of his company's past research. He opened file after file, scanning them with clinical precision until he came upon something that stopped him. Cold Project Orion. It was a shelved initiative from over a year ago focused on pediatric neuromuscular disorders, including a subtype that matched the very symptoms Noah displayed. His signature marked the termination order, the memo citing insufficient commercial viability. Torn, a cold weight dropped into his stomach. He'd unknowingly killed funding for a program that could have helped his own son, his own flesh and blood. At the time, it had been an efficient decision. Now it was a brutal indictment of his values. He stayed up all night reading medical journals, reviewing notes, calling in favors from researchers he hadn't spoken to in years. By dawn, he had a plan. The next day, the specialist, Dr. Lena Kapoor, arrived with a clinical team and portable diagnostic equipment. Charles watched from the hallway as they examined Noah with a quiet thoroughness that seemed to both comfort and overwhelm the boy. The physical assessments were grueling, testing his grip, strength, respiratory function, reflexes, but Noah never complained. He answered questions with a soft politeness and glanced occasionally toward the hallway where Charles stood half-hidden. When the tests were done, Dr. Kapoor joined Charles in the library. "His condition is degenerative," she said gently. "It's not terminal, but it is progressive. The earlier we intervene, the better chance we have of maintaining his quality of life." Charles nodded, jaw tight. "What do you need?" "Access funding. A research team that won't be shut down if the projections don't align with the stock market. He met her gaze. You'll have all of it. Late that night, as the household fell quiet, Charles found himself standing once more outside Noah's room. He knocked this time. A soft voice called, "Come in." Noah was in bed, reading under a small lamp. A brace supported one leg. His sketchpad was on the nightstand, open to a half-finished drawing of the garden. "Do you draw a lot?" Charles asked, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "When I can," Noah said. "My hands get tired now." Charles hesitated. "Your mother never told me?" "She said you didn't want kids." The boy didn't say it with anger, only certainty. That made it worse. Charles sat at the edge of the bed. "She was right. I was wrong." Noah didn't reply, but something shifted in his expression. A softening, an understanding far too old for 9 years. Before Charles left, Noah reached out and handed him the sketch pad. "This is for you. I started drawing the house, but I didn't finish." Charles took it, his fingers brushing the paper. "Then we'll finish it together." And for the first time in years, he meant it. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Morgan estate, catching flecks of dust in the air, as Charles Morgan stood at the edge of the grand dining room, observing his son Noah sat quietly at the table, a glass of orange juice untouched before him, flipping through a book on space exploration. His eyes lit up whenever he reached a page about distant planets or galactic mysteries. Charles noted it, how his son's mind reached for distant places, even while his body betrayed him. It had been a week since Dr. Kapoor's visit and the confirmation of Noah's diagnosis. Since then, Charles had moved with purpose, not just as a businessman or philanthropist, but as a father. He restarted Project Orion with the backing of his private fortune and personally hired Dr. Kapoor as its head researcher. Resources began shifting, labs reactivating, and scientists who had once abandoned hope were summoned with fresh contracts and funding. But none of it mattered if he couldn't reach the boy in front of him. That afternoon, Charles instructed his team to begin structural renovations on the house. Ramps replaced stairs, bathroom counters were lowered. A private physical therapy room was designed off the west wing, with both aesthetics and accessibility in mind. Charles even commissioned an adaptive piano to be built into the music room, remembering a detail Dr. Kapoor had mentioned. Noah had played piano before the symptoms worsened. On the second Friday since Noah's arrival, a pediatric nurse named Elena Hart joined the household. She was efficient and kind, her energy warm without being condescending. She quickly earned Noah's trust. But Elena wasn't hesitant about voicing concerns, especially when she felt Charles was too removed. "Mr. Morgan," she said one evening after dinner, "Noah doesn't need a palace. He needs presence, yours." Charles tightened his jaw. "I'm giving him everything I can." "Except you?" she said gently. "And that's the one thing he wants but doesn't know how to ask for." Those words echoed late into the night. Charles found himself wandering the halls of the estate until he arrived at the music room. He stepped inside, flipping on the lights, and stood in front of the sleek, grand piano. It had dust on the keys. He ran his fingers over them but didn't press. He hadn't played in decades. The next day, Charles surprised everyone by showing up at Noah's therapy session. Elena had been helping Noah stretch his limbs, slow to respond, his hands clumsy with effort. When Charles stepped in, Noah froze. "I thought you had meetings," Noah said, sweat beading at his temples. "I canceled them," Charles replied. "You're more important." They didn't say much during that session, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the beginning of something tentative and real. Later that afternoon, Charles brought Noah into the music room. "I had this adjusted," he said, revealing the modified piano. "For you?" Noah's eyes widened. He wheeled himself forward, gently setting his fingers on the keys. He tried a scale, missing a few notes, but then tried again. A simple melody formed, halting, fragile. But there, his face lit with a quiet pride that Charles hadn't seen before. Elena watched from the doorway unnoticed. That night, Charles asked Noah a question he hadn't dared until now. What would you do if your body didn't hold you back? Noah looked up from his book. I'd build rockets. Real ones. Ones that go to other galaxies. Mom used to say I was born looking at the stars. Charles's throat tightened. What if I told you that you could still do that? Noah's face was still, but his eyes shimmered with something between disbelief and hope. Then I'd say, I want to try. And for Charles, those words weren't just a child's dream. They were a new mission. He wasn't just building ramps and restarting research anymore. He was building a future. Not just for Noah, but for every child like him. For every dreamer trapped in a failing body. For the first time in his life, Charles Morgan was learning what it meant to invest in hope. The boardroom at Morgan Biotech, usually a space of quiet confidence and sterile luxury, buzzed with tension. Charles Morgan stood at the head of the long glass table facing 12 of the most powerful figures in the pharmaceutical industry. His executive board, his proposal laid out with meticulous care in the stack of documents before them, had already sparked whispered conversations and furrowed brows. I'm reallocating 35% of our annual research budget to pediatric neurodegenerative disorders, Charles said clearly, specifically those affecting muscle degradation, like the one impacting my son. The words hung in the air. No one moved at first. Then the CFO, Leonard Walsh, leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Charles, he began carefully, you've built this company into a global leader by avoiding precisely this kind of sentimentality. We're not a charity. These diseases affect a tiny percentage of the population and generate virtually no market return. Charles met his gaze without flinching. And that's why no one's been helping them, because we've all agreed it wasn't profitable enough. That ends today. You're asking us to gut our most profitable R&D sectors. Patricia Rowe, the head of investor relations, chimed in. Oncology cardiovascular. Do you know how Wall Street will respond? I do. Charles said, I expect the backlash. I expect the hit to our short-term profits. But I also expect this long-term innovation, public trust, and a company that's about more than profit margins. He paused, scanning the room. This is not just about my son. It's about thousands of children, and I'm not asking for approval. I'm informing you of the direction I still hold, majority interest. But for how long? Leonard replied coolly. Hostile takeovers don't require your permission, just a shareholder rebellion. Charles straightened his shoulders. Let them come. I faced bigger. After the meeting, Charles returned home to find Noah sketching in the sunroom. He was drawing the night sky, each star labeled a soft concentration on his face, that Charles had come to recognize as peace. Hey, champ, Charles said, pulling up a chair beside him. Noah glanced up. How was your meeting? Tough. Did they hate your idea? Charles hesitated, then nodded. Most of them did. Will they stop you? No, Charles said they'll try, but I'm not giving up. Noah nodded slowly, then looked back at his drawing. Mom used to say, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing anyway. Charles felt a lump rise in his throat. She was right. Later that week, Dr. Kapoor returned with new scans and trial projections. The data was sobering. Noah's condition was progressing faster than anticipated. Respiratory weakness was beginning, and his physical strength was diminishing month to month. We still have options, Dr. Kapoor said, but time is now our most critical variable. Charles stared at the report. What do we need? Accelerated trials, expanded protocols. It's going to take money connections and a hell of a lot of push. You'll get it, Charles replied. By the end of the week, he had personally reached out to leading geneticists across Europe and Asia, leveraging every ounce of his influence. Privately, he funded a state-of-the-art research wing within his foundation, recruiting disillusioned scientists whose rare disease research had been shelved by other corporations. Meanwhile, at home, the renovations neared completion. Every hallway had been adjusted, every door widened, the pool had been equipped with lift access, and a hydrotherapy program was scheduled to begin the following month. But what changed most wasn't the infrastructure, it was Charles. He began attending Noah's therapy sessions. They played simple chess matches in the evening. Charles learned how to help with Noah's stretches, and even downloaded apps that explained his son's condition in simple medical terms, so he could follow along. One night, Noah said, "You don't talk about her much." Charles paused. "Your mother?" "Yeah." Charles looked away, his voice catching. "Because I'm ashamed." "Of what?" "That I didn't fight harder when she was sick. That I stayed distant. That I let the wrong things matter too much." Noah placed a frail hand on his father's. "You're here now." And somehow, that simple statement did what no victory in business ever had it healed. In that quiet room, with the weight of guilt and hope between them, Charles Morgan realized that love wasn't something you bought or even earned. It was something you showed up for every day, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The lake cabin stood quietly beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, a place that felt untouched by the chaos of boardrooms or medical charts. Charles hadn't returned here in nearly 2 decades, not since the early days of his marriage to Leah. Back then, the cabin had felt too small, too quiet, irrelevant to the life he was chasing. Now it was exactly the kind of space he needed. Somewhere real, somewhere human. He had made the decision without much warning, simply announcing over breakfast, "We're going away for the weekend." Noah had looked up surprised, but curious. Rebecca, ever cautious, had raised concerns about accessibility and emergency care. Charles had already planned for all of it: portable equipment, a local clinic nearby, and a satellite nurse service on call. But the real reason for the trip couldn't be packed in a suitcase. Charles needed space to reconnect, not as a CEO, not even as a caregiver, but as a father trying to become the man his son still believed he could be. They arrived just before sunset. Noah wheeled himself onto the wooden deck, his breath catching at the sight of the still water reflecting the golden sky. "Whoa," he whispered. "This is awesome." Charles watched him silently, feeling something shift inside. "It used to be your mom's favorite place." She said the lake reminded her that even stillness has power. That night, under a quilt and a sky full of stars, Noah asked, "Why did you stop coming here?" Charles took a long breath, I think, because this place reminded me of everything I didn't want to feel. Vulnerability. Quiet. Her. He looked down. "I spent years running from all of that." Noah didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "I'm glad you brought me." In the morning, they sat side by side with fishing rods in hand. It was slow, unproductive fishing, but that wasn't the point. Charles showed Noah how to cast a line, how to wait, how to listen to the sounds that get drowned out in a busy life. "My grandfather taught me this," Charles said, "before the company, before everything. He believed success wasn't just about achievement, it was about resilience." "Did he think you were successful?" Charles hesitated. "He died before I built the company. But no, I don't think the version of me he would have seen later is the one he'd be proud of." Noah glanced over. "I think he'd be proud of you now." They returned to the cabin with one fish, which Charles insisted on cooking despite its modest size. It wasn't gourmet, but it was theirs. That night they lit a small fire outside and shared stories. For the first time, Charles talked about Leah in full color, the woman who loved jazz, collected antique maps, and could never remember where she put her keys. "I miss her," Noah said quietly. "But I think she'd like that. We're doing this." "I think she'd be proud of you," Charles replied, "of how you carry so much with grace." Noah turned to him, eyes serious. "She wanted me to be brave, but not just with doctors. She wanted me to stand up for others too, even if it meant giving something up." Charles froze. He knew where this was going. "The trial," Noah said, confirming his fear. "I don't want to take a spot from someone else. Someone who doesn't have a dad with money and power." Charles clenched his jaw. You are not responsible for fairness in a system that was broken before you were born. Maybe not, Noah said. But if I get a treatment and some kid doesn't just because he's poor, how do I live with that? There was no immediate answer, only the crackle of the fire and the weight of a boy's clarity pressing on the heart of a man who had spent a lifetime justifying impossible decisions with numbers. That night, after Noah went to sleep, Charles stepped outside and made a call. His research director answered on the first ring. "We're expanding the trial," Charles said. "Find a way. We're going to give this to more kids. Do what it takes. You realize the cost." "I don't care, I'll sell my shares if I have to." And in that moment, the man who once counted value in dollars felt the quiet reckoning of discovering what real investment looked like. It wasn't about saving face, it was about saving futures. The soft light of morning spilled into the mansion's redesigned hallway, casting gentle shadows across the freshly installed handrails and widened doorways. The house had changed physically, emotionally. Where once cold efficiency dominated every corner, now warmth had slowly begun to settle into the architecture, as if the walls themselves were learning how to breathe again. Charles stood at the window of his home office, watching as Noah wheeled through the garden, maneuvering carefully along the smooth stone path they'd installed just a month ago. His cast was gone, now replaced by a lightweight brace, and while his steps were still uncertain, they were his. Charles had learned to stop counting progress in leaps and start honoring the inches. The boardroom battles were far behind him. When he'd announced the launch of the Leighton Foundation for Rare Pediatric Research, named quietly after Leah's maiden name, it was not a gesture. It was a commitment, one funded not by shareholders, but by the sale of Charles's controlling interest in his own company. A move that stunned the industry, sparked headlines, and divided his peers. To many, he'd walked away from power, but Charles knew better. He'd finally walked toward purpose. Inside the foundation's headquarters, a modest but state-of-the-art facility in the heart of the city. The air buzzed with the energy of something rare, hope backed by science. Charles didn't arrive as a CEO these days. He arrived as a mentor, a fundraiser, a father. And on this particular day, he arrived beside Noah, who wore a name badge reading Junior Research Advisor, a title Charles had insisted upon after Dr. Chen praised Noah's unique insights. It had been 2 years since that letter at the cemetery, 2 years since Noah's hand reached up through loss and altered the course of Charles's life. The boy who had once waited silently for answers now offered his own, and the man who had once held a child's diagnosis at arm's length now stood at the center of a movement that gave hundreds of families a voice. In the main lab, the atmosphere was electric. Scientists, doctors, and families gathered for an announcement that had been whispered about for weeks. Dr. Chen stood at the front, her voice calm, but her eyes bright with emotion. "We're here today not only to report promising results from our expanded clinical trials," she began, "but to share something none of us dared dream 2 years ago. Through a combination of modified protein therapy and targeted gene modulation, we've not only halted the progression of certain neuromuscular conditions, we're beginning to see regeneration of previously compromised muscle tissue." Gasps rippled through the room. But the moment that followed wasn't scientific. It was human. Dr. Chen turned to Noah seated at the back and extended a hand. "Noah, if you're ready." All eyes turned. Noah nodded once. Then, with quiet determination, he rose from his wheelchair, his frame trembling but upright, and then he walked slowly, carefully across the floor toward Dr. Chen. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was reverent. Parents wept. Scientists clapped with trembling hands. Charles remained rooted in place, watching through a blur of tears. He had never been more humbled. Later in the Foundation's private courtyard, Charles, Noah, and Dr. Chen planted a young tree beside a bronze plaque etched with the words, "Dedicated to every child who dared to hope." Noah patted the soil with quiet pride. "Mom would have loved this," he said. "She's part of it," Charles replied, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "She always will be." And he meant it. Because this wasn't about redemption anymore. It wasn't even about legacy. It was about love. Quiet, hard-earned, unconditional love. The kind that takes root slowly, but grows stronger each year. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles looked at the tree they had planted at the boy beside him, at the woman who had become not just a brilliant doctor, but part of their growing family. And he finally understood. Healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in moments, a letter, a promise, a second chance. And sometimes when you least expect it, it walks across the room in the form of your son, who once was lost to you, and now is everything you never knew you needed. In the story of Charles Morgan and Noah, we witnessed the extraordinary transformation of a man who had once built walls around his heart in the name of power, success, and certainty. Charles was a brilliant pharmaceutical executive, known for his clinical precision and unyielding drive, yet utterly disconnected from the human impact of his decisions. But everything changed the day. A small boy in a wheelchair handed him a letter and, unknowingly, a mirror. That boy was Noah, his son, born from a past. Charles believed he had buried beneath boardroom achievements and sterile data sheets. What began as a moment of reluctant obligation turned into a journey of redemption, love, and deep humanity. Charles did not just find out he had a son. He found the missing part of himself. He faced the uncomfortable truth of having once abandoned promising research into Noah's very condition, driven by profit margins and market forecasts. But rather than crumble under guilt, he chose to rise. Charles reclaimed not only his role as a father, but as a human being who dared to care even when it was painful, even when it demanded the hardest thing of all change. Their bond grew in quiet, powerful ways through hesitant conversations, late-night science readings, and the long process of learning how to show up not just with resources, but with presence. Charles turned his empire on its head. He walked away from control, from ego, and from a life that once defined him in order to fund and launch a foundation that prioritized children like Noah. Those the system had deemed not profitable enough. In the end, the true legacy was not the medical breakthroughs or the headlines. It was the moment Charles watched Noah, once thought too fragile to stand, walk across a laboratory floor in front of a room full of families whose lives had also been changed. That walk was more than a physical achievement. It was a symbol of healing, of grace, and of the kind of love that is built, not born. The lesson in their story is this: it is never too late to become who you were meant to be. Redemption does not require perfection. It requires action. Charles didn't erase his past. He learned from it. He changed because of it. And in doing so, he changed the future for hundreds of children. In our own lives, we are often caught between what is easy and what is right, between comfort and courage. But this story reminds us that when we choose love, responsibility, and vulnerability, we unlock something greater than success. We build meaning. What about you? Have you ever had a moment that changed the direction of your life completely? Or a time when you had to step up even when it was hard? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. If this journey of love growth and second chances moved, you don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the strength to keep bringing powerful stories like this to life. Thank you for being here.